Well, you have now made it to session 10, the final session of the Old Testament survey. Well done. And in this final session, we are going to talk about the wisdom literature of the Hebrew Bible. And so naturally, a question arises, well, what is the wisdom literature? Well, these are the books that sometimes you might refer to as the poetical books. They are poetical in style and genre. Now, this doesn't mean that they are outright poetry in the rhythmic sense. In fact, there are three types of Hebrew poetry. For example, there is lyrical, which means it is to be accompanied by music. We see a lot of this in the Psalms. Hebrew poetry can also be instructional, teaching principles of living through pithy maxims, and we see this reflected often in Proverbs. It can also be dramatic, a narrative that tells a story in poetical form. We see this represented by the book of Job. And so these books will present how to live well in God's world, as well as how to cope with it. And so these books, once again, representing Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Songs. And so we will begin our time today with the book of Job. Now, Job could be the oldest book in the Hebrew Bible, since Job likely lived in either the patriarchal period, so the time of Abraham to Joseph, or he could have lived before it, so between Noah and Abraham. We honestly don't know. We also see, too, as we look, that Job, a non-Israelite, could have been a contemporary of Abraham. Now, some do take this story as fictional and say that this story is an analogy to learn from. Yet, I would argue that Job was a real person, because Job is mentioned in James chapter 5, verse 11. And it would be unusual, at least we see in the New Testament, for someone to be mentioned that wasn't real. And we also see that the author of Job is unknown. And so again, there's a great amount of mystery to this book. So if we were again to line out our Old Testament books according to order, the book of Job is going to happen again in those sometime in the early chapters of Genesis, post-flood into Genesis 50. Also, the name of Job means hated or much persecuted. So it could be that this was a name given to him in light of his suffering. These are part of the things that you have to wrestle over and discern what you think about them. But it's at least some food for thought. A couple of key clarifications about Job. To begin with, the book of Job does not, and I cannot underscore this enough, does not answer the problem of evil or try to explain where evil comes from. Not at all. Instead, Job is about the relationship between suffering and divine justice, as well as divine goodness and sovereignty, in other words, God's control. It's speaking about how do we handle the relationship between these. So Job pushes its audience to think about what they will do in encountering evil, because evil is a part of living in this world. The book of Job resists the idea of karmic justice, and that's something that must be emphasized. And karmic justice is the idea that good occurs to those who do good, and that bad occurs to those who commit evil actions. Job makes clear time and time again that this is not the case. Job's friends think it's the case, but that's just not true. Instead, God is free to do as He pleases. I want to emphasize that again. God is free to do as He pleases. So again, good things can happen to both good people and bad people. Bad things can happen to both bad people and good people. And this is something, again, Job makes clear. In addition, the battle between Job and his friends seems to revolve around their accusations, based on the conventional wisdom of the times, rather than on God's redemptive self-revelation. And Job's complaint that their accusations do not apply to his situation. And God challenges these to each one of them personally in chapter 42, 7 and 9. Another question that arises as we look at the book of Job is, who is the Satan, or the Satan, or literally the adversary? Because the word Satan in Hebrew, it means adversary. In Job chapter 1, the reader encounters the Satan, the adversary, or as some put, the challenger. Traditionally, this has been viewed as Satan or the devil. Yet, there are those who believe this may be a New Testament reading of an Old Testament text, since the adversary could represent one of the angels in Yahweh's court. You might remember our discussion about Yahweh's court back in our first session. If this was the case, this would explain the adversary's access to the throne of God. It would also explain his role appears to be one of an evaluator. Because again, his deal is, I don't really know if Job loves you as much as you say. He just seems to love you because you bless him. As with many issues in Scripture, there is debate on this, and so hard conclusions are elusive. I merely raise it for you just so you recognize this is something that is debated, and would encourage you to take the time to study and discern where you might land on this. But as again, the book of Job begins with a debate where Yahweh points out Job's faithfulness. And we see that the Satan says that Job is being faithful only because Yahweh blesses him. And so Yahweh allows the Satan to test Job. It's important to note here that the Satan cannot do anything beyond what Yahweh has allowed. So again, he cannot do whatever he wants. This is all done within Yahweh's allowance, thus demonstrating the ultimate power that Yahweh has, while also highlighting the tension of God allowing tragic events to happen to people. Ultimately, this will force us to make a decision on whether we trust Yahweh to be good and loving, or whether we do not. I would again encourage you with some of the verses we have previously, whether that's Deuteronomy 29:29, Ezekiel 18:24, 2 Peter 3:9, but again, going back to John 3:16-18, that God so loved the world that He sent His only Son, that whoever believes in Him will not perish but have eternal life. This is a God that loves us so much so that He came down and died for us. I do believe Him to be trustworthy. But as we get into this, we see Job's protests, because as his situation unfolds and he has everything stripped from him, his friends make the assumption that his situation is actually the result of his actions, of his unrighteous actions. But Job makes it clear time and time again that his situation is unjust. Because I am righteous, he says, and I am innocent. Yet because his friends take a karmic view of life, they cannot accept this. They believe that God runs the world according to justice. And so they assume that Job surely has committed evil, albeit maybe in private. So in other words, you must have done something that even we can't see. And so they argue with him about this. I personally love the sarcasm expressed by Job in chapter 12, verse 2, and it's repeated by God in chapters 39-41, because it challenges the conventional human wisdom and conventional human perception, where this writer, with his clever subtleties, makes it clear that God is at work and that God doesn't operate by a karmic scheme. Again, Job with his friends, well, I guess you understand everything now. And it's going to become apparent in the same way with God later with Job. Job, it's clear you don't understand everything. Because were you there when I made the world? Were you there when I did this? Oh, you weren't. And so it's this type of sarcasm, too, that occurs within the book. There are also 3 speech cycles within these friends. So in chapters 3-14 of Job, we see, is God just? In chapters 15-21, does God operate on strict judgment? And in chapters 22-27, how is Job's suffering explained? One of his friends, Eliphaz, incorrectly holds that God will only intervene in the lives of humanity to punish them for their sin. Thankfully, that is not the case. Here's some other incorrect conclusions from the book of Job. Based on his innocence, Job concludes what? Well, look, I'm innocent, these things shouldn't have happened, so therefore God does not run the world according to justice. And then he says, well, if that's the case, then God is unjust. Therefore, he demands an audience before God and an explanation, We see this in chapters 29 to 31. And at this point, Job remains silent and he says, I will not talk anymore until God gives me an audience, because I don't think He's just and I don't believe the things that have happened to me are right. At this point, Elihu arrives in chapters 32 to 37 to give his piece, but Job will not debate him. Elihu is going to hold that suffering is a gift from God to teach His people and to develop their character. He's going to rebuke Job for his accusations against God. But again, Job doesn't respond to Elihu. And after Elihu is completed, we see that Yahweh arrives on the scene. And He arrives in a whirlwind to challenge Job and his friends in chapters 38 to 41. And in these chapters, these are some of my favorite chapters in the Bible. And to me, it's some of the most beautiful stuff in Job, because it's an amazing description of God's power and God's knowledge, where God shows Job, look at the things I've done, look at what I've created. Were you there when these things happened? God also emphasizes their lack of understanding, and that their perspective, not just Job, but also his friends and anyone who is there, is far too small to see the whole picture. He sits as though you have blinders. There is so much more that you are not grasping. You are seeing just a small piece. You might remember my illustration of the tapestry. In other words, Job, you're seeing the small little part here, but there's a whole painting that you're not seeing, a whole tapestry that is there. A quote by A.W. Tozer says this, "Whoever defends himself will have himself for his defense, and he will have no other. But let him come defenseless before the Lord, and He will have for His defense no less than the God Himself." And this is the posture that we need to take before God, the recognition that we don't completely grasp things, and let God defend us. It is not our job to put God on trial. And this is one of the things that God is making clear to Job. Yahweh also illustrates in this time, in chapters 38 to 41, that the world is too complex to operate on human perceptions of strict justice alone. In other words, Job, hey, the world's kind of complicated, isn't it? And so as a result, the call is to trust that God is running the world in a way that is both wise and in line with what is right, even whenever we don't completely understand it. And this message is just as powerful then as it is now, where God is saying, just as He did in Deuteronomy 29:29, the visible things belong to you, but there are secret things that belong to me. You have to trust me. I am aware of information that you are not. You know, this happens in the case of the President of the United States. Every time a new president is elected, there is a meeting between the outgoing president and the incoming president, where the outgoing president reveals to the incoming president what really is going on. And it's at this point that maybe some of the views that the incoming president expressed on the campaign trail, or some of the promises that he made, begin to hit up against reality as he sees, oh, I didn't really understand the full story. There's a lot of things that were beyond my understanding. And as we walk away in the book of Job, we are called to trust the loving God. And this is exactly what Job does when he repents of his arrogance and is therefore restored by Yahweh. All the things that he has lost, he has given back. And so this is how the book of Job ends. Now, there are other books within the poetic literature. Among them, the book of Psalms. Massive book, a collection of 150 Hebrew poems, songs, and prayers. The title of this book in the Hebrew Bible is Tehillim, which means praise songs, since some of these were sung in the temple. And you'll see that they have instruments of like accompany with this instrument, do this thing. And you'll see that whenever you read the psalm. These were likely collected and organized in their current form sometime during the exile. In addition, there were multiple writers for the Psalms. The ones we know of are Moses, David, who composed quite a few of the Psalms, Solomon, Asaph, and we know there are others. In fact, as I mentioned before, David has at least 73 Psalms to his credit. This is also the most quoted book in the New Testament, with 400 quotations from 35 different Psalms. So again, this would be a book that the Jews would have been very familiar with. The Psalms is also a book like no other. It opens up a range of emotions and expressions. It gives voice to feelings of doubt, frustration, pain, anger, as well as joy, relief, triumph, and surety. It also offers a window into the emotions of the ancient Near East, because the writers of the Psalms show us, what are these people thinking? What is going on? And so the Psalter bridges the gap between then and now, the ancient world and the present world, as Patrick D. Miller Jr. says here. In addition, the Psalms invite us to experience how God's people in the past related to Him, as Willem van Gemeren states. They provide an encouragement to us in our present day, while also pushing against rigid, stoic expressions of the Christian faith resulting from the Enlightenment. Because remember, in the Enlightenment, we have to have proof. Things must be known. All things must hold against reason. And so the idea of the emotions was pushed out. But Psalms make it clear. Emotions are part of life. How are you going to deal with them? What's going to happen? And so all humanity who read the Psalms take encouragement from them. As I mentioned, there are many Psalms. There's no way we can cover all of them. I've just chosen to focus on one in particular. And this is Psalm 72, which is talking about, again, the idea of a future hope. So pointing to a Messiah. So this psalm in particular is a prayer for the Davidic king. So it's a reminder of the messianic promises that Yahweh made to His people. We see that it's a fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham of being a blessing to the world. You might remember that going back to Genesis 12 and Genesis 15, that He was going to give him land, which they did later in the Promised Land, seed or children, which He did subsequently with the Israelites and His descendants, and then finally blessing. The Messiah will be a part of that blessing. This also turns the Davidic covenant in 2 Samuel 2:7. It fulfills it by showing this is what's going to happen with the Messiah. And the continued encouragement for the Israelites. This would serve as that through their struggles and challenges, because it speaks of the Messiah's power and the influence over the nations. It looks to provision for the poor, the needy, and the destitute, and that Israel will be blessed by His reign and be the envy of the world. And so, with these kinds of psalms and others would have been of great encouragement to the people of God. I also take great encouragement, for example, from Psalm 103, verses 8 to 13, a fantastic passage on forgiveness, where we're told that God will remember our sins no more. And as far as the east is from the west, that is how far He removes our sin from us. Or maybe Psalm 130, where we're told that God does not keep a book of sin. He doesn't keep a record of our sins. And so again, there are many more texts and ones that I'm sure are dear to you. And so I want to continue to encourage you in your understanding and growth in reading the Psalms. Well, there also is a text known as Proverbs. And Proverbs is a fantastic book because it's the Jewish traditions that point to Solomon as author. Again, we can't say absolutely, but more than likely, again, just as Psalms was, Solomon did have some in there, but David was the primary writer. Solomon proves to be, again, historically, points to the writer of Proverbs. We read in 1 Kings 4:32, you can hear my time in New Zealand coming through right then. He composed 3,000 proverbs. That's quite a lot. And some of these, it would make sense that some of these would be included in Proverbs. In Proverbs 10:1 to 22:16, and in chapters 25 to 29. These have been recognized as well as the Proverbs of Solomon. Chapters 1 to 9 could possibly be Solomon or another writer. We also learn in chapter 25:1, it tells us that Hezekiah collected these sayings, so there could be others that he collected as well. The book of Proverbs contains multiple authors because it quotes multiple people. We see the sayings of the wise that shows up in chapter 22, verse 17, to chapter 24, verse 34. So again, these could be things that have been passed down over time. We have Agur and his Proverbs that show up in chapter 30, 1 to 33, or Lemuel, chapter 31, 1 to 9. And so, as a result of this, we have multiple authors. It's important to understand, too, that the Jews debated whether Proverbs should have been included in the Hebrew Bible. And this was due to Proverbs 26, verses 4 and verses 5, which you may or may not be familiar with. But in those verses, we're told, answer a fool according to his folly, and then also, don't answer a fool according to his folly. And so people sat there and like, hold on. This is a contradiction. On the one hand, I'm being told, answer this fool. And on the other hand, I'm being told, ignore this clown. What do I do? And so this was perceived, at least by some, to be a contradiction. And so the Word of God can't be contradictory. Thankfully, they realized that it's a situational proverb, that sometimes there are times when you do answer the fool according to their folly, and that there's other times when it's wise not to. You need to discern when those times are. And so I just wanted to throw that in there because I think it's important for you to understand as well that this is not a contradiction, that there are situational moments for Proverbs. And this is a great transition to the next slide, which is the key points for Proverbs. To begin with, a proverb is usually a succinct statement that stands in place of a long explanation and expresses a truth about reality. So it's succinct, and instead of, hey, I'm not going to give this long explanation, just going to be succinct, and I'm going to express a truth about how things are. And so Proverbs are maxims. This is generally how life works. If you live according to this way, this is generally what will happen. They are not absolutes, nor are they promises. So what it describes is what generally will occur, but not absolutely. For example, one proverb says, raise up your child or your son in the ways of the Lord, and they will follow God. Generally, this is true. Generally, if we lead our children in the ways of God, they too will walk in the ways of God. But is that always the case? Absolutely not. There's plenty of people who have chosen to not walk in the ways of their parents. And we must remember that. And so Proverbs is great at telling us wise living. This is generally what will happen. Because as Ecclesiastes and Job makes clear, you can be wise and godly and yet still suffer greatly. So again, these statements are not absolute. In addition, a proverb is a truth that has been tested by time. So like Job's friends, Proverbs expresses conventional wisdom, not promises or doctrine. Conventional wisdom is what we observe to be true about life, often apart from God's divine intervention. So it should not then surprise us to hear 26, 4-5, because they are both true in human experience. Again, sometimes I answer the fool, sometimes I don't. Also, there is a structure to a proverb. You will see this phrase, how much more than, argued many times. And so Proverbs can argue from the lesser to the greater. So, well, if this is true over here, where it's lesser, how much more over here? And so that is one of the perspectives that it likes to use. By the way, this is a common tactic used by the writers of the New Testament as well, arguing from the lesser to the greater. So for example, there are many ones that can be cited, but another thing that can be used as well is to show advice using a negative perspective. And so, in other words, by looking at what not to do and then learning from that. One of my favorite shows when it was once on, and I am dating myself, whenever I was in college, there was a show called Behind the Music, where they would go and learn about all these bands. And so these bands that were really like train wrecks, these were the ones you were waiting for. And there was one particular band, and they went on tour with another large band, basically. And it was supposed to be this mega tour of the early 90s. And they talked to him, they said, "What did you learn from that tour?" The tour ended up imploding. And the bass guitarist off the band that was still around, he goes, "We learned what not to do." And so again, sometimes learning what not to do is just as important as learning what to do. How about a key theme in the book of Proverbs? Proverbs 1:7 says this, "Fearing the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, but fools despise wisdom and instruction." Again, fearing the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. This is a major theme of the book. Because to fear Yahweh is to hate evil, Proverbs 8:13. And to fear Yahweh is to avoid sin, 16:6, with the result being a long life. This is again where Proverbs is saying, live long. You want to live long. Do you want to avoid pain? Do you want, in other words, avoid pain that you can avoid? Do these things. Again, one proverb that I particularly like says, "The wise man sees destruction and walks away, whereas the fool walks right in." So again, pain is a reality, but don't walk into pain. Be wise and go around it. So as a result, be wise and fear Yahweh. Do not be foolish. One character that emerges in the book of Proverbs is Lady Wisdom. Now, this isn't a real person. It's a personification of wisdom. We see this, again, you see the references there on your screen. Proverbs 1:20-33, 3:13-20, chapters 8 and chapters 9, where wisdom offers her knowledge to anyone who will take it and warns against foolish living. Wisdom is presented as if it were a self-conscious divine being, distinct but subordinate to God. But in reality, it's the personification of the attribute of wisdom displayed by God. I think, again, that's important to recognize. Wisdom is not some God, some other God besides God. It's a personification of how God calls us to live, a personification of God's wisdom. And so in chapter 9, too, wisdom offers life, whereas folly or foolishness offers pleasure. And ultimately, in the end, life is what the godly person is after. The wise person is after life, not pleasure, which again Ecclesiastes will make clear is fleeting. Proverbs 31, we also see wisdom personified as a woman and a symbol of all of what wisdom represents. The infamous Proverbs 31 woman. But we see this is what wisdom looks like. And Proverbs, again, is a book that, I don't know about you, but the longer I read it, I love it. But remembering it all can be, it's so elusive. And so it's something that I continue to commit myself to try to learn the wise things and recognize that, again, this is what, if we walk according to these ways, generally, this is what will happen. But sometimes, even whenever you walk wisely, things don't turn out the way you expect them to. And that is what the book of Ecclesiastes is all about. Now, the name Ecclesiastes is not the Hebrew name. This was given in the Septuagint. You remember the Greek translation of the Old Testament, the LXX, okay? Since Ecclesiastes means assembly. But it's also referred to as Kohelet. You will hear people talk about Ecclesiastes as Kohelet because this means teacher. And this speaks of chapter 1, verse 1, where the teacher is going to tell us things. The teacher is also a character in the book. And Jewish traditions point to Solomon as the author, that this was something that Solomon wrote later in life. And the reason the tradition does, if you look at Ecclesiastes 1:1, I mentioned it there, that quote, the son of David, king of Jerusalem. And so again, is this Solomon? It could be. It could be that Solomon wrote this later in life. Critical scholars and some conservative ones do not hold to Solomonic authorship. They claim that there's linguistic and stylistic problems. Yet, linguistic issues have been refuted by Gleason Archer, another conservative scholar who I highly recommend. And so again, I'm more in the camp that I have no problem admitting and dealing with the fact that Solomon was the author, and I take him as such. And so the author of the book introduces Kohelet, introduces the teacher. And the book begins with, again, you might hear the infamous phrase, meaningless, meaningless, everything is meaningless, or vanity of vanities, everything is vanity, in Ecclesiastes 1:2. The word used there is hevel, and hevel can be translated as vapor or smoke. So just as vapor goes off a hot cup of coffee or smoke comes off a fire, it's there for a little bit, indicating the temporal nature of life. So hevel, hevel, smoke of smoke, vapor of vapors, everything is vapor. This phrase is used 38 times in the book, indicating once again, the temporal nature of these things. And so the teacher shows the emptiness of things people try to build their life upon. You name it, it deals with it, whether it's wealth, materialism, pleasure, accomplishment, even knowledge. All of these things are elusive. They will not fulfill. They are hevel, hevel. It's chasing after the wind. The book is quite dark, and the darkness of this book led Jews to debate whether it should be included. Because they're like, man, this book, this is so bad, it's depressing. But they chose to include it because it's true. It's true to life. This is one of my favorite books of the entire Bible. And I would encourage you, if you haven't read Ecclesiastes, to read Ecclesiastes and to spend time in it. There is a great amount of wisdom in this book. So let's deal with some concluding thoughts in Ecclesiastes. To begin with, Ecclesiastes makes it clear that life is short and that death befalls everyone. To use a baseball analogy, death bats 1,000. So unless you're Jesus, Elijah, or Enoch, death is a reality. And so no life circumstances can erase this reality. Death will catch us all. And that is something, again, that people have to be reminded of. This is why the book of Ecclesiastes says that a house of mourning is better than a house of laughter. Because it's in the house of mourning that people begin to reflect on their life and wonder, what have I done? What am I doing? And this transitions well to the next bullet, that the things most people build their life upon are ultimately meaningless and empty. And so Ecclesiastes calls us to reflect upon our life and say, what are you building on? What is there? Are you looking for this to fulfill you? It won't. It's hevel, it's smoke, it's vapor. At the same time, Ecclesiastes said, because it's hevel, because it's vapor, enjoy the simple pleasures of life. Find balance. Better is one hand at rest and one hand at work than two chasing after the wind. And so we are told 6 times in the book of Ecclesiastes that pleasure is a gift from God. And once again, you see the reference that I just used, Ecclesiastes 4:6. And so, to quote Ecclesiastes 12:13, to fear God and keep His commandments, for God will evaluate every deed, whether good or evil. So Ecclesiastes, near the end, reminds us, hey, everything we do will be evaluated by God. So yes, things are smoke. They are meaningless. But make sure you evaluate and invest in what is meaningful, because God will one day evaluate that. Again, fantastic book. Encourage you to read it. And we're going to conclude our time today by looking at the Song of Songs. This is the last book in the wisdom literature. And so this is an interesting book because Jewish tradition held the author as well to be Solomon. And some of you might be like, well, I thought it was called the Song of Solomon. Well, it could be that Solomon was the author. His name is mentioned in chapter 1, verse 1, hence the name Song of Solomon in some translations. Again, going back to 1 Kings 4:32, we know that Solomon composed 1,005 songs. So it could be that this is part of it. It could also be written by someone else during that period. It's hard to ascertain. Again, we do believe it to be the Word of God, and it's included. Sometimes authorship on these books can be elusive, and so we ultimately don't know. But it's also conceivable that it was Solomon. As well as with Ecclesiastes and Proverbs, the Jews had an issue with this book. They debated it too because they thought its content was too racy. And so its inclusion was debated. And so people wonder, hold on, is this a love song between lovers or a picture of God and His commitment to Israel? Or even for us now in the New Testament, His later church. This is something that people have tried to discern. It can be all of which. I do believe it does refer to a love song between two lovers. It is the expression of what love is between a husband and a wife. And this is another reason why people say this could have been Solomon in his early life, when he was initially married or in some of his first marriages. Also, its structure matches other love songs of the period for which it was claimed to be written. It's also a book that is problematic when it comes to interpretation. The great German scholar Franz Delitzsch said, "It's the most obscure book of the Old Testament." How's that for encouraging? It was also said that among the books of the Bible, the Song of Solomon is one of the smallest, most difficult, yet one of the most popular with both Jews and Christians over the centuries. Hundreds of books and commentaries have been written and unnumbered sermons preached on these. 117 verses. Think about that. G. Lord Carr, again, I take comfort in that quote. I don't know about you, but at least I do. So, if this is the case, if this is such a tough book, if it's so hard to discern, what can be said? Well, it is at the very least a love poem or a collection of love poems. We can say that for sure. There are at least two, if not three, characters. One of those is the Shulamite girl, her shepherd lover, and maybe Solomon, though Solomon may be the shepherd. Song of Songs seems to indicate an idyllic picture of romantic love and intimacy, perhaps to validate it between men and women, but also as an analogy of God's desired relationship with us in covenant faithfulness and intimacy. This, by the way, is contrasted with Hosea's experience with Gomer. Remember, Gomer would cheat on him. She would run off and be with other men. But here in this book, we see covenant faithfulness and intimacy. This is what Revelation 21:3 fulfills, is that God is in and among His people. He will be their God. We will be His people. So then, what can be said? Well, quote, "The song fills a necessary vacuum in the Scriptures because it endorses sex and it celebrates it beyond all expectation. Sex is not inherently evil, nor is it limited to a procreative function. Instead, sex enables an experience of love whose intensity has no parallel in this cosmos and serves as a signpost to point to the greater love that lies beyond it." Thus says Richard S. Hess. And I think that is a great reminder because, again, what did we talk about at the beginning of this whole series? That God is creator and that God made us in His image. And He has so designed sex. But the adversary, the father of lies, he likes to convince people of things that aren't true. And so if he can convince us of one of God's greatest gifts isn't a gift at all, that it's something dirty or bad, then he has scored yet another victory. The Song of Songs show us that no, sex as God designed it is good. And it also points to that greater love that lies behind it, that one day, again, Revelation 21:3, when we are in the presence of God and we are His people, He is our God, and we are united together. Well, this concludes the Old Testament survey. You have made it. You have made it to the end of 10 sessions. Thank you so much for your attention and your hard work. I want to continue to encourage you in your study and development of understanding regarding the Old Testament. And I also want to encourage you to check out the other classes that we're offering under Biblical Studies. And I look forward to seeing you then, and one of those. Take care.